In this video, I'm going to be discussing 8 strategies that I'm implementing personally with respect to my own wine collection. The first strategy I'm implementing is to buy more current release collectible wines and to focus less on back vintages. For years, this was just the opposite, and in fact, in some of my older videos, you'll often hear me say that you can get some older vintages of Bordeaux, for example, from the 2000s for much less than the current releases, and that was particularly desirable because those vintages were also much more approachable and ready to drink. That's all changed, however, because there's been a tremendous run-up in the price of wine in the secondary market. And now you'll find that older vintages, such as those from the 2000s, especially of big-name collectible wines, are much more expensive than current release wines. And so for that reason, I've shifted a little bit, and now I'm focusing more on new release wines. But there's another reason that I'm focusing more on newer wines and less on older wines, and that is because the quality of wines being produced has never been higher. In Bordeaux, for example, the wine being made today is much better than that, even in the legendary 1982 vintage. There's a few reasons for that. In Bordeaux, for example, the recent string of warmer vintages due to global warming has resulted in more consistency and has helped to ensure that the grapes get ripe each year. In addition, producers are using a much more stringent selection. And so whereas in the 1980s and 1990s, a very large percentage of the harvest would go into the top wine, today they maybe only use the best 40 or 50% of their fruit for the top wine, and the rest goes into the second wine or the third wine. The creation of the EU also had a beneficial impact on the quality of wine throughout Europe, as there was substantial investments in the wine industry made in countries like Spain that have resulted in much higher quality there as well. But it's not limited to just Europe, and you'll find that there's high quality wine being produced all over the world. The next wine collecting strategy that I'm implementing in my own collection is to take stock of all my wine clubs and mailing lists and make sure that I'm culling them to get only that which I really need. Especially in the United States, many of the wineries like to sign people up for direct shipments, whether it's a wine club or a mailing list. With a mailing list, you typically have a little bit more flexibility in terms of being able to order only that which you want, whereas with wine clubs, oftentimes it will just be some sort of a package that they'll send you, and sometimes you may not even know what you're getting. But in any event, all of these tend to add up very quickly. And so for that reason, if you're not careful, you could easily end up with a situation where you have dozens and dozens of bottles from a particular producer and your cellar becomes imbalanced. And so it's important to take stock every once in a while and consider if you really need more wine from that particular producer. And if not, don't be afraid to get off the mailing list or to cancel your wine club. You can always get back on later. Financial advisors are always touting the benefits of having a diversified portfolio when it comes to investments, and they want you to make sure that you're mindful and intentional with respect to your asset allocation. If you're not intentional, it's easy for imbalances to occur. And so they're always recommending that you rebalance your portfolio every year or so. The same is true with respect to your wine collection. And so the next wine collecting strategy that I'm implementing for my collection is to make sure that the weighting of my collection aligns with my current consumption patterns. If you have cellar management software, this is very easy to do because you can oftentimes run a report that will show you your allocation by country and by region. So you can quickly figure out, for example, that you'll have 8% in Germany, 25% in France, 10% in California, and so forth. Once you have the weighting of your collection by country and region, you'll then want to consider your consumption patterns. That's also something you can get from your cellar management software if you have it. But if not, just think to yourself how often you want to drink each of the various wines. So for example, if you drink German Riesling once a month, you'll know that you want to have around 8% of your portfolio dedicated to German Riesling. And if there's a particular wine that you drink once a week, you'll want to have around a third of your portfolio weighted towards that particular wine. Don't panic or take any drastic action if you find that your weighting doesn't necessarily correspond exactly to your current preferences. You can just be mindful of that and use that information to make tweaks on a going forward basis. And before long, things will be in balance again. Once you take a critical look at the weighting of your wine collection and compare that to your current consumption patterns, you'll probably discover, as I did, that you're underweight in some of the categories that you enjoy most often. So the next strategy that I'm personally implementing is to make sure that I boost my cellar defenders with respect to those categories for which I'm underweight. Cellar defenders are particularly critical because by definition, they're wines that are both ready to enjoy immediately or in the near term, and which are sufficiently interesting that they'll keep you from the temptation of indulging in some of the wines that you should be aging in your cellar. And if you're underweight in these different categories, you're definitely going to need some immediate relief and not just wines that you have to age for a long time before you can enjoy them. In my case, for example, that means that I'm buying lots of multi-vintage or non-vintage champagne, and also I need to buy a lot more Northern Rhone, as I tend to drink a lot more of those two categories, but yet I don't have as many in the cellar as I should have. If you're interested in wine recommendations, wine collecting strategies, and learning more about wine, please do subscribe to my channel. I've been collecting wine for more than 15 years and also have a level 4 diploma from the WSET. So I have both formal certification as well as substantial practical knowledge from the School of Hard Knocks. The next wine collecting strategy that I'm implementing for my own collection is to consider selling some wines, and that is selling potentially two different categories of wines, both those in which I have big gains and those in which I'm no longer interested. As with stocks, it's always a good idea to buy low and sell high. So if you have some wines that have appreciated dramatically in price, and it's to the point where you could no longer enjoy them in good conscience, then definitely consider selling them and taking some gains and using that money to buy some additional lower price wines. Likewise, if there's some wines that you don't enjoy anymore and that you have no interest in drinking, you can definitely consider selling those off as well. I know one easy way to do that could be through something like WineBid, or perhaps through one of the message boards like Wine Berserkers. And another thing that I've done in the past is also donate them to charity. I found that there's lots of charities that will be running auctions where they'll sell things like wine, and then you can take a tax deduction and it will help the charity out as well. Another thing that I found to be extremely useful for my wine collection is once a year I'll actually go through my cellar and lay eyes on every bottle that I have, and I'll consider whether this is a wine that I should drink in the near term or it's something that needs substantial aging yet. If it's something that I want to drink in the near term, I'll put it towards the front of the cellar or someplace where it's easily accessible. Likewise, if it's wine that I should be aging for a number of years, I'll put it somewhere where it's difficult to get. I found this to be a very useful technique because in the past, every once in a while, there was a bottle that would kind of slip through the cracks and I would discover it after it was way past peak, and that was always very disappointing. And so by doing this annual inventory, I've been able to fix that problem and help to make sure that nothing slips through the cracks. The next wine strategy that I'm implementing now is to be extremely careful with respect to the retailers from which I'm purchasing wine. If you're buying wine futures, for example, such as the Bordeaux 2020 futures, you definitely want to be very careful and make sure that the place that you're buying the wine from will still be in business in a couple of years when the wine gets delivered. This is particularly important now that big retailers, such as the one in New York that's been in business for decades and is extremely well known, are having significant financial problems. And given the challenging economic environment, there's a number of these stores that are going out of business or having very hard times. You definitely want to do your due diligence, especially if you're going to be buying wine futures. If you're buying wines for immediate delivery, such as those of back vintages, you also want to make sure that you investigate the provenance of those wines. The best source of these older wines is definitely straight from the producer or ex-chateau, and it's also sometimes worth purchasing from a collection if there was a large collection from an auction house, for example, that you know did their due diligence and they came from a very good cellar with excellent provenance. But in the last year, for example, I've noticed that there's a large amount of wine that's being sold in the secondary market that's just not very good. And even some of my friends have purchased some of these wines, and we've tasted them, and we've ended up just pouring them down the drain. Even if the wine is selling for a reasonable price, sometimes it's too good to be true. And if you end up just pouring the wine down the sink, then you're overpaying regardless of what that price is. So it's definitely very important to investigate the provenance of your wines and try to buy only extremely high quality wines, even if you're buying from the secondary market and even if the price is right. The next wine collecting strategy that I'm implementing in my own collection is to get wine insurance. At first, I was reluctant to getting wine insurance because I always thought about the wine that I could buy if I didn't have to spend that money on the premiums annually. But then I realized that since I live in Texas, if my compressor goes out or if there's an extended power outage, my entire collection could be at risk. And this is definitely true for people that live in Florida or in California, certainly when they have rolling blackouts on almost an annual basis. So you'll definitely want to consider wine insurance if your collection has been getting up there in value, and certainly if it's to the point where your collection is worth about as much as your vehicle. You definitely wouldn't go without car insurance, and so you wouldn't want to go without wine insurance either. For more wine collecting strategies, be sure to check out the video in the pinned comment below.